Today, we're going to be discussing the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the unique challenges they pose when conducting a workplace investigation. One of the interesting things about this topic is that when we're faced with these types of investigations, for the majority of us, we just simply can't identify with the complainant. Many of us have never been the only colored person in a workplace. And therefore, it's very difficult to understand someone's complaint when they come forward saying, hey, my vacation is not being approved, or I'm being passed over for promotion, or these comments are being made and I find them problematic. We just simply can't identify with those experiences and how those things might be interpreted or might be where we might actually have a finding of discrimination here. So those are some of the challenges that make doing investigations in this context really unique, and something that we hope to help you with today as you unpack and address these issues in your own workplaces. My name is Dorian Persaud. I am the senior lawyer at Persaud Employment Law. We are a team of lawyers that are specialized in conducting investigations and helping you to create healthy workplaces through investigations, training, and proactive advice. I'd like to introduce you to Garnetta Cromwell, and she is an individual who works as a salesperson in a furniture store. And she loves her job. She connects really well with her clients. She knows exactly what they need, and she's doing a fantastic job. Her sales manager is thrilled with her. Garnetta is selling furniture, and clients are happy, and he's more than happy to cut her the commission checks that she's earning each month. She is doing such a fantastic job that the sales manager actually promotes her to say, I'm going to give you some supervisory duties, and you are going to, in addition to what you're currently doing, also supervise deliveries. And Garnett is thrilled with this, and she has ambitions to continue moving up the hierarchy of the company. Unfortunately for her, the sales manager moves on to a new role and somebody else takes his place. And that person doesn't take as favorable a view of Garnetta, and he starts to make certain comments. He'll refer to her as Condoleezza Rice in front of clients. When he's speaking to colleagues, he'll refer to Garnetta as Contessa. When Garnetta messes up, and if she misses a shift or does something really small, the punishment just seems to be a little extreme. The company doesn't follow its progressive discipline policy when she makes a mistake. And she notices that just certain routine decisions, things like vacation that routinely would get approved for her colleagues, in her case, she's treated differently, and those things are not a routine at all. So she's having to fight a lot more, and she's feeling singled out and not feeling great about the comments that are being made to her and about her. And everything comes to a head one day when she's called into the manager's office for her annual performance review. And there are some other colleagues who happen to be in the room at the time. And the manager clears the room by announcing, hey guys, you need to leave now. A lynching is about to take place. Garnetta is a Black woman. You can imagine how shaken she is by this comment. She brings these issues to the attention of the company. They appoint an internal investigator to look into the complaint. And that internal investigator, he has no experience investigating an allegation of racial discrimination. He hasn't received any training on conducting that type of an investigation, and he can identify with Garnetta's complaint. So, and this is evident in terms of how he then approaches his investigation. He is looking for the smoking gun. He's approaching it from a broad context and asking the responding party and employees in the workplace if they have observed any or heard any incidents of racism or any racist comments being made. And when you're looking for the smoking gun, you then gloss over or miss entirely all of the subtleties of the racist behavior that the complainant has been subjected to. And that mistake and what happens there is easy. It's an easy mistake for any of us to make, right? Because we don't identify with the complainant, because these things don't make sense to us. It's easy for that to lead into a place where we don't believe the complainant. And we then go about our work with that bias built into the process. And when you undertake a workplace investigation and you've got that bias that's present from the outset, that usually leads to very bad results. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And so we're going to unpack this case of Cromwell and Leon's Furniture later in this presentation, so you can see how that case unfolded and how it turned out. When you're approaching issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the things that you need to acknowledge at the outset is that these are difficult topics to delve into, and that we all have different levels of sensitivity to it. And so we have to be mindful of that and just check our participation as we have these types of discussions in this forum and in your workplaces as well. In terms of coming to this work, people are complicated, right? We have grown up being conditioned as far as how to view ourselves, and we've also been taught how to view and perceive others, right? And so we bring these we bring this experience, and we bring these these preconceptions with us into the workplace, and that naturally results in conflict. And at a basic level, conflict is to be expected, right? It's just a difference of opinion, and so that's generally seen to be the norm, right? And not the exception. But for us, managing workplace conflict, we have to recognize that, just because there is conflict, and even if it's reasonable conflict, it doesn't displace the fact that, that conflict is disruptive and upsetting. So we want to do our best to address those issues and continue to foster healthy work environments. The scenario that we reviewed briefly with Garnetta, and how easy it was for the human resources manager investigating that complaint to walk in there and make those mistakes. That's typical, I would say, of what happens in this work, right? Because we can't often identify with the complainants and the issues, that creates one challenge that we have to overcome. And then another challenge is that, for the most part, you don't have folks out there acting intentionally who want to injure their colleagues, right? So oftentimes these conflicts, they come to us in a very benign way. And so I'll give you the example here of a worker by the name of Joe, and he comes into the office, after Mother's Day weekend, and he's got a bouquet of flowers, and he greets all the admin staff who are female, and he's like, "Hey, girls, I just want to wish you all a very belated happy Mother's Day," and greets them all cheerfully and gives them the flowers, and is feeling really good about what he's done. And Joe means well, but he, may be unaware that there are some folks in that group who don't identify as female. And there are others in that group who are struggling with infertility issues, and they would love to have a child of their own, but that's not the circumstance in which they currently find themselves. So what Joe meant as something positive and good ends up causing hurt feelings from those on the receiving end. So what do we do? How do we handle this situation? Do we just say, hey, you know what, guys, just be happy that you got some flowers. And if you're so offended by it, go and file a harassment complaint and then we'll deal with it. Or, do you express some concern for how Joe's actions made these individuals feel, and try to sit down with Joe and work through the issue so that he can learn from it and understand how his words were received and the impact that they had. So let's just say you take that approach. Joe then, understandably, for him, this may be just coming out of left field. He's just not used to these issues or coming up, or folks, communicating, being displeased with a simple, in his view, what he sees as a simple Mother's Day greeting and a kind gesture. So for Joe, he feels that, he tried to do something good, and he went out of his way to buy these flowers and to greet these folks and show his appreciation for them. And here he is being put on the hot seat. And many of us can sympathize, right, with Joe, who isn't alert to these issues and doesn't appreciate the times in which we live, and his lack of awareness of the issues that are out there in the workplace. So what we want to do in terms of making this a healthy experience is to help not to come down on Joe, and we're not looking to tear a strip off of him. We're trying to help him understand the dynamics at play, with the goal of encouraging him to learn from the event and to communicate in a healthy way, and to get to know his coworkers differently, and to maybe get away from some of the assumptions that might be informing how he has behaved up until this point. Right. So you're dealing with someone who's tried to do something good, who's angry at being called into a meeting with HR to discuss it. And we want to do that in a way that, as I said, builds him up as opposed to tearing him down. So there's that fine balance, right, that as HR managers and folks doing this work, that we need to find in terms of how do we balance the situation and deal with them in a way that eliminates any escalation. The other piece of this too is not simply passing this off as a quote unquote a little thing that we can ignore. Many of the investigations that come across my desk are the result of these little things that are ignored over time. But that thing that maybe wasn't offensive 9 or 10 months ago, over time, when those behaviors and those comments are repeated and nobody is following up and having conversations with the perpetrators, those are the things that over time build into a bigger issue and end up in a formal investigation that then needs to be unpacked and resolved. So it's important to not skip over these little things, but to deal with them in a timely way. So what are the takeaways here? We want you to not gloss over these events, to approach them in a compassionate and through the lens of helping folks learn from these experiences, and in this case, helping Joe understand the assumptions that he made, going into that room and offering the greeting and giving the gifts, the assumptions that he made, and letting him know that those assumptions just can't be made without and as happened in this case, where they are made, you end up with some folks on the other side who may have upset feelings. So it's something that you can learn from and apply going forward. When we reflect on the story that we covered at the outset, Garnetta, the salesperson in the furniture store, experiencing these subtle and not so subtle behaviors. And we see the approach from the HR manager wanting to jump in and look for that smoking gun, actually asking individuals, have you heard any racist comments? Assuming that if they had heard something, that the racist comment would have to be something that was really obvious, that they would all be aware of and understand, and then report back to him. That reflects bias, right, in the investigation process. And simply put, bias is just a form of prejudgment that isn't fair to any of the parties in an investigation. And in terms of how bias is played out or how that's evident, we see that in terms of how the evidence is collected. We see that in the questions that are asked. We see that in the weight that's given to that evidence, and then ultimately the conclusions that are reached. It's important to also acknowledge that bias can be conscious and unconscious. We all bring our unique life experiences and perspectives to everything that we do, including the work of investigations. And that can lead us to, lean one way or the other. And sometimes we're aware of which way we lean on a certain issue, or we are aware of the values that we favor in terms of doing this work. But other times we aren't. And so as an investigator, then you need to be able to ask yourselves the right questions to acknowledge and to uncover whether or not there is bias or unconscious bias there before you approach the work. You want to keep in mind here that for someone who might be challenging your investigation, they don't actually have to show that there was actual bias in the conduct of the investigation. The question is whether or not the investigator maintained an open mind and hasn't predetermined the issue. So you can have what's called a reasonable apprehension of bias, where a reasonable person looking at the situation and having thought the matter through, would that reasonable person think it's more likely than not that the investigator in this case, whether consciously or unconsciously, would not decide the case fairly. An example of this would be the investigator who has known the responding party for 10 or 20 years. Is that person going to be able to approach the work honestly and ask their friend these really difficult questions and potentially make a conclusion against their friend? And looking at that situation and that relationship between the parties, would there be a reasonable apprehension of bias if you're the complainant in that case? Or if there's a sexual harassment case against the CEO of a company and the HR manager has to go in and ask these tough questions, do you, as say the intern who has brought this complaint, do you have any confidence that the HR manager is going to sit down across the table from the CEO and ask these really difficult questions in what is, by definition, a very sensitive area, and hold that person who has such positional authority over them, really hold that person accountable? If you're the intern in that situation, you're probably not liking your chances for a fair investigation. So what you're trying to do when you put a process in place is to make sure that it's free from bias, but also the perception of bias. At the end of the day, you're looking to do a job. You want to get to the truth, and you want the parties involved to have confidence in the conclusions that are reached and in whatever outcomes flow from the investigation. When it comes to unconscious bias, by definition, it is difficult to articulate. Again, we come to our work with experiences that we've gained through childhood, through interactions with our teachers and family members. And we then have this preconceived notion in terms of how certain people look and behave and should act. So an example here is an old lady who may be accused of misconduct. Well, if we have this preconceived notion that old ladies are nice and they bake chocolate chip cookies and they're the salt of the earth and they can only act in a certain very kind and benign way, we're going to have a difficult time with the allegation that this old lady whacked the nurse over her head in a nursing home, and be able to approach that work in an honest way to get to the conclusion of what happened, right? So we all carry these biases. Another one is if somebody is really upset about something, if what they're saying is true, if this really traumatic thing happened, they should demonstrate some sort of upset over it. They should be in tears, right? They should be crying. What happened to them is awful. If that really happened, why aren't they crying? Or if this person is really telling the truth, why can't they look me in the eye? So these are some of the things that, again, it's not going to determine an entire case necessarily, but you want to be conscious that these biases exist, and acknowledging them then helps you to address that bias in terms of how you ask questions and making sure that you're not limiting yourself to certain questions, that you're taking a more holistic approach and you're examining all of the evidence as opposed to letting your bias take you down a very narrow path. And by doing so, you're ignoring a whole lot of evidence that's available to you, and that would change the outcome of your conclusions at the end of the process. So in terms of unconscious bias, we tend to favor people who are like us. We are going to favor people that we get along with and that we have a relationship with. And oftentimes we might have a preconceived notion of what actually happened in this case. And we're then, in terms of doing the work, we're looking for the evidence that confirms what we already believe. And we're attaching a lot of weight to that evidence. And because of that, you're tipping the scales, right? You are determining what the outcome of the investigation is going to be, because you're looking for information that just confirms the way that you see that this event unfolded. Some of the mistakes that we see investigators make is the unequal treatment of a complainant or a respondent. So because you don't really believe the complainant's allegations, you take the written complaint and you might not meet with them at all. You might just take the written complaint and run off and do the investigation. Or you meet with the parties, but you give one party a lot more time to provide their evidence or search for relevant documents, and they have a greater opportunity to participate in the process than the other party. Another mistake that we often see made is a lack of even-handedness in the investigation. So you have met with relevant witnesses, you've collected this evidence, you are reviewing it, and you come across some information that favors the other party and that doesn't jive with the conclusion that you expected to reach. And instead of pursuing that information and following up on that lead and meeting with additional witnesses to really wrestle with that evidence, you just ignore it and go with what you have to reach the conclusion that you're looking for. Another mistake that we see made is having an interest in the outcome. Maybe a harassment complaint has come forward now, and these incidents have been taking place for a number of years, and this has all happened under your watch. Well, you then maybe have a vested interest here in terms of finding that there is no harassment. You don't want to make a finding of harassment because it might cause the company or the organization to shine a light on you and say, well, how is it that these things have been happening for such a long time? Why is it that you haven't looked into them sooner and addressed them in an effective way? Why are we dealing with this complex investigation now for issues that have been taking place over a period of 2 years? If you want to sweep those things under the rug and just make them go away, then that's an example of bias in the investigation process. We talked about prejudging the outcome. That's a big mistake that's made, and once you prejudge the outcome, it'll dictate who you meet with, how long you meet with them, the type of questions that you ask, and ultimately the conclusion that you reach. And we talked about having a prior relationship with a party and how that might influence whether or not you are able to hold them accountable and make a difficult decision at the end of the day. The same bias that we see at an individual level is also present at an organizational level. We just had a report come out recently from the Assembly of First Nations where they found a lot of males in a leadership position in that organization were sending inappropriate text messages, and there was inappropriate touching and comments of female members. And these issues have persisted for some time, but have not been addressed. They've just been swept under the rug because as an organization, you can't make an allegation against certain untouchables and certain folks who are respected and in positions of leadership. And so those complaints get pushed off to the side. So in doing this work, you want to be aware that there are individual biases, but there's also that same issue can exist at an organizational level. In order to uncover the unconscious bias, what you as the investigator want to do is ask yourself, can you honestly approach this work? And can you approach this complaint and allow yourself to be guided by the evidence? So you want to know that you can listen to the parties, right? That includes both parties. You want to be able to follow the evidence and make an evidence-based finding at the end of the day. Are you able to disregard that feeling or that hesitation maybe of displeasing one of the parties or displeasing a member of senior management? Can you make what may be an unpopular decision? Those are some good questions for you to ask in order to address any conscious or unconscious bias that might exist. Again, understand that when you're doing this work, that there may be systemic issues at play. And when you want to analyze whether or not, take a look at the organization as a whole, right? When we're talking about issues of diversity and equity and inclusion, what are the events that we celebrate as a company? Who are the folks that are in positions of power? When folks are terminated or they resign, do we do exit interviews to determine what their concerns were and what was their experience like at the organization? So these are some things that you can look at and implement in order to determine how good a job you're doing at building an inclusive environment. In one study done by Forbes, they identified and interviewed a host of individuals, and I want to summarize some of these conclusions that came out of these interviews. And one of the challenging facts that came out is the exhaustion that some minorities feel in the workplace. Included some of the quotes here for you. In one case, this individual says, I'm the only Black person in the company, and it's the most exhausting experience of my life. And there's several reasons for that. One of the reasons is that some of the folks are looking at this individual, and you're the example, or you're setting the standard for all the Black people that might follow, right? They're looking at you and the quality of your work and the way that you behave and your performance as being reflective of everyone else that comes after you. And so there's that responsibility that's placed on this individual. There's oftentimes a higher standard, right, that folks complain of. And so we have another quote here where this person says, "It's exhausting. I have 2 master's degrees, but I constantly have to prove how smart I am because I'm often mistaken as an administrative assistant," right? So it's that stress and that exhaustion of constantly having to prove yourself, whereas your counterparts who are not visible minorities, they don't have that same hurdle. There's almost automatic credibility that they have based on the color of their skin. And whereas for folks who are in the minority, they're having to fight and struggle to prove themselves at every step of the way. So that's something that most of us wouldn't automatically be aware of, and it's something to be cognizant of. So being the only person of a certain culture or background, or being the first person of that culture or background in a workplace, it definitely takes a toll on individuals. In that same survey, when Forbes interviewed white workers, there's a perception there that just 39% of those individuals believe that their co-workers have experienced this behavior. Right? So because they haven't experienced it before, and having grown up as part of the dominant culture, it's not something that they feel or that they experience or that they maybe witness and understand what they're witnessing. So when asked the question, only 39% believe that folks have even experienced this type of behavior. So it's easy for us then. So it's important to understand these statistics, because it helps us to acknowledge that we're not expected to know it all. And we are trying our best to create a fair and an inclusive and a diverse workplace. And in doing that, we all have our own shortcomings, and one of them is the assumptions that are made. So we want to acknowledge that many of us fall into this boat, and once we acknowledge that these mistakes are easy to make and can innocently be made, we can then take steps to improve and to increase that awareness and do our work with this understanding to make sure that we're not allowing our assumptions or our biases to guide us. We're allowing ourselves to be open-minded and addressing this work in an honest way. So what do we do going forward? We want to have you want to make sure you have values, you have policies in place that show an appreciation for differences. You also want to respond to the complaints that are brought your way. You don't want to let things slide. You want to take timely action and conduct proper workplace investigations, and that shows that you're leading by example, right? When you respond to these issues in a timely way, when you conduct a proper investigation, that reinforces the values that are outlined in your policies, and it helps you to address issues of misconduct, helps the parties to learn from that, and helps you as an organization to move forward and improve. When we get it wrong, when we don't conduct a proper investigation, there's a reputational damage, especially in this day of social media. You make a mistake, and that has a strong likelihood of ending up on a social media platform. Maybe it ends up in the traditional media, and this story then takes on a life of its own. It's shared, and this becomes a story that you can't get away from, and it impacts your reputation, which has an impact not just on the bottom line, but in terms of recruitment and folks who you might want to attract to work for you. These stories that are out there might make them think twice. And especially in a competitive job market, these are things that you just simply can't afford to happen. So you want to make sure that you get it right. Another impact here, if you get it wrong, is the impact on workplace morale, right? Folks leave because they see that these behaviors are allowed to persist. And no matter what you might say in your policy, well, that policy actually doesn't have any meaning, because when push comes to shove, you're not actually going to undertake a meaningful investigation. And the perception is that you really aren't interested in what actually happened. You just want to reinforce or continue the status quo. I want to review a few cases with you before we move to our question and answer period of how companies have botched investigations into these issues. And the first case is in the Basanesi and the German Canadian News Company. And this is a situation where an older worker came to her her company and said, "I'm being verbally abused by my manager, and this has been going on for some time, and I can't take it." She comes back again and says, "Look, I've made several complaints. I'm at my wit's end here. I don't know what to do about this guy." And things come to a head one day when she's apparently slapped by the manager a few times in the workplace. In the wrongful dismissal suit that followed, one of the things that the court noted is that this issue was just simply not investigated. The company never took these allegations seriously. They didn't conduct an investigation, and she was dismissed essentially for filing a complaint, and damages were awarded as a result. So she was given 19 months of salary in lieu of notice, and there was aggravated damages that were awarded because of the failure to investigate and take any steps to address the inappropriate conduct both before and after the physical assault. So these things are traumatic for the parties involved, but can also be extremely expensive then if you don't handle them in the right way and they end up in litigation. We talked about our friend Garnetta Cromwell and what she went through at Leon's. And in that case, as we pointed out, the investigation was flawed, right? The investigator had no training or experience conducting an investigation into allegations of racial discrimination. And he was looking for a smoking gun. And by taking such a broad approach and asking folks in a very broad way if they've observed or heard any racist comments or conduct, he ignored all of the subtleties of the allegation and at the end of the day conducted a flawed investigation. And in that case, again, it cost the company a significant amount of money, 18 months in lieu of pay, damages for discrimination, and then cultural competence training ordered for all of the company's personnel. So you want to take your time in these issues. You want to be trained. You want to approach this work in an honest way. And when it comes to diversity and equity and inclusion, you're trying to establish a workplace that's fair. You want to do these investigations to really understand what's happening at work. You want to do that reflection of yourself to understand what biases you might be bringing into doing this work, and do that self-reflection at the individual level and corporate level to just understand what's taking place, that the organization can take positive steps forward. And when it comes to what you need to have in place, you want to have robust policies and investigation mechanism to investigate complaints, so that your policies actually have teeth, that you can get at the information that you need to make better decisions and to create a healthier workplace going forward. And you want to make sure that when you're doing that work, it's not just a matter of doing the investigation, as we've seen. You want to make sure you're doing a proper investigation, one that's free of bias or the perception of bias, and one that's going to stand up to scrutiny at the end of the day. And you're doing this work with an understanding that you're making an investment in the culture of your workplace. This is not going to change overnight, that this is a step work that you're going to undertake and that you're going to repeat. And by repeating it and doing the right things consistently, you're going to change the culture of your respective workplaces and do a great job and build the healthy environment that you are aiming for. So this work is different. It requires us to realign priorities and really look at how power is shared, and requires us to roll up our sleeves to do some difficult work. And if we're willing to do that, we can be sure that there is going to be some tension, there is going to be some conflict, there is going to be some making up that we have to do as we reconcile workplace relationships after feelings have been upset. But at the end of the day, we get to a place where we have a healthy and inclusive work environment. So with that, I want to open up open it up now to questions from you, and I would encourage you to just use the Q&A function there within Zoom to pose your questions, and I'll be happy to take each of them in turn. That we have covered a lot of ground here, so maybe many of you are still digesting that information, but yeah, we do have a good amount of time allotted to answering any questions that you might have, whether that has to do with the cases that we've covered, or any hiccups that you've encountered in conducting these types of investigations. Questions come forward where the question is as to whether or not any Caucasians have been prejudiced against that ends up going to court. So has a Caucasian individual gone to court and complained that they were discriminated against? I can certainly send you cases on that issue. It's not, when it comes to race, anyone could be discriminated against. I know we focus on folks who are visible minorities, because those are predominantly the cases that come forward, but certainly someone who's Caucasian can be in a work environment where they're discriminated against. And I have had cases where you have Caucasians working for a First Nation organization, and they've been maybe treated differently from their counterparts, and other similar examples of that. So if you are looking for a case about where that's happened, and that's something that you want to look into further, please do send me an email, and I'd be happy to have my team send you some of those cases for you to pursue further. Another question that's come in is, what are the main steps that an employer should take for a successful investigation? I love this question because it's important to understand that you don't have to conduct a perfect investigation. And in fact, you can conduct an investigation and you can get it wrong. You just have to take reasonable steps in the circumstances to create a healthy work environment, to respond to the complaint that's been brought before you. So in terms of a successful investigation, what you want to do at the beginning is, listen to the complainant. Make sure you understand what that person's complaint is. A lot of people make the mistake of, they get an email or some written complaint that's submitted, and that document might have 3 things that the person's complaining of. And instead of taking the time to meet with that person and to unpack that complaint to make sure that you understand all the nuances of what they're complaining of and who's involved and who the potential witnesses might be, unless you've taken the time to make sure that this is all of their complaint, this isn't just the 3 things that they've sent you via email, but this is actually everything that they want to complain about, and you just run off and do the investigation, then you're going down the wrong path, because oftentimes there is more to the story. And if you don't take the time to meet with that person and to hear their story, you might not be investigating the things that you need to be investigating. The other part of it too is a recognition that oftentimes it's that conversation that the person has with the investigator, whether that's an internal or an external person, that's a cathartic experience, right? That has a healing quality in and of itself, because they are then able to sit down and share, look, I've been going through this very difficult time, and it's helpful for them to get all of this stuff off their chest that they've been wrestling with and they've been fearful of, and they are now able to communicate that and feel some sense of security that you are going to pursue it, whether or not you decide in their favor or not. At least you listen to them and you are going to pursue those complaints. So you want to listen to the complainant. You want to make sure that you understand their allegations and that you know the whole story, hear all the things that they want to investigate. You want to be robust in vetting these questions with the responding party. You don't want to be fearful in doing this work. And if you feel that for whatever reason, it's really hard for you to sit across the table from the responding party and say, look, did you, for example, ignore this person's complaint? Did you treat them differently after they brought this to your attention? Are you reprising against them? If it's difficult for you to sit down with a responding party and have a difficult and put these tough questions to them, then you're just going to be covering this ground at a high level, but not really digging in and holding them accountable, then that's not going to lead to a successful outcome, right? Because oftentimes responding parties are sophisticated and they're going to give you an answer that is easy to accept, on its surface. And you oftentimes have to dig deeper and ask follow-up questions and really, get to a spot where they might feel uncomfortable. And oftentimes, many investigators are, find it challenging to do that. And so they don't do it. And they don't get the answers that they need, or they let their responding party off the hook. So you want to be able to, meet with the parties. You want to be able to demonstrate to the complainant at the end of the day that you really looked into this issue, and here's what your policy says. Here's what harassment is. Here's how harassment is defined, and here's why. For example, their boss putting them on or their supervisor putting them on a performance improvement plan, while that might be difficult for them to accept, and while they don't acknowledge that they have these performance issues, here is why that performance improvement plan might be uncomfortable, but is not harassment. But you have to be able to, you have to go through and do the work to make sure that the responding party is acting in good faith and that they're going about this the right way. And that's a successful investigation. You've listened to the parties, you have asked the difficult questions, you have reconciled this evidence you've gathered with your policies to see if there is a violation here, and then you're reporting back to the party. And they may not be happy with the outcome, but that's a successful investigation because you've done the work in an honest way. And if anybody raises questions, you may not have gotten it perfect, but you've done a reasonable job, free of bias, and that's all that's expected of you. Another complaint is, how would one investigate for subtleties in a race complaint? That's a great question. In the investigations that we often do, you are looking for that differential treatment, right? How did the responding party behave in this situation and not another situation? So if we think of a situation, say, involving a principal, in a school, maybe if there's a concern that's brought forward to them, it's racial discrimination. You look at how they acted and how they responded to that concern, and then if they have other concerns that are brought by other students, right, who are not visible minorities, right, or from another cultural group, say the dominant culture, how does that person behave in that instance? And it's not just one example of that, but that's looking again. What you're looking for is that differential treatment, how they behaved in one instance, based on certain folks coming to them. How do they behave in another instance? What are some of the decisions that they made when concerns were brought to their attention? Were those decisions reasonable? Asking them to explain the basis for it, especially if it's something that's over the top. If a student comes to you and says, look, I've been part of this violent altercation, or somebody is using this obviously racist language and saying it to me, and that isn't followed up on, like those things, right? Like where the response to the complaint just is not consistent with what you would expect a reasonable and informed and educated person to do in those circumstances. So in terms of what those subtleties might be, they vary from case to case. In the case that we covered, there were these comments that were made, and the boss in that case was calling this woman Garnetta. He was calling her Contessa. He didn't call anybody else in the workplace that. He was just saying that to her. And so what is Contessa? She looked it up and saw that that was something that in the movies from a certain period, that tend to be the name that was given to the black slave who was working in the home. That person or that character was named, often named Contessa. And so that's where that reference comes from. And he was only saying it to the black employee. It wasn't like he was calling, all the women at work Contessa. So those are the things that are subtle or not so subtle. But it's little things like that that you are looking for. It's is this person acting reasonably in the circumstances? How are they treating this one person in contrast with how they treat others? And race doesn't have to be the entire explanation, but if it's part of the reason, right? If race is a factor in terms of the behavior, what's being said and what's being done, then that's enough to make a finding of discrimination. Another question that comes up that's been posed here is, when it comes to findings, how do you determine the level or options for repercussions absent any corporate policy in place? How do we determine so when we've conducted the investigation and we've made a finding, how do we determine what the options are and what's appropriate if there isn't a corporate policy in place? Oftentimes, and so this is really going to vary based on whether or not you are working in a unionized context or a non-unionized context. In a unionized context, they will more than likely have, they will have a collective agreement, and they will more than likely have a progressive discipline policy, something that indicates, look, here are the range of options that are available. And the employer will then have some discretion in terms of whether you start at the beginning of that progressive discipline policy, or given the nature of the misconduct, you move straight to a suspension as opposed to a written warning, right? So there's going to be a framework there for you to follow. In a non-unionized context, in terms of your common law rights, and I'm cognizant here that this is not a forum where I can provide you with legal advice. So certainly, if you're contemplating disciplining an employee in a non-unionized context, please do seek advice from a competent employment lawyer on that issue. Because in terms of the common law, there is no common law right to discipline an employee. You can't just say to a non-unionized employee, okay, you engaged in this act of discrimination or sexual harassment, and we are going to suspend you for 2 weeks and then bring you back to work. Unless there's a term in your employment contract with that person that gives you the latitude to discipline them, then the only remedies you have as an employer is continued employment or denying them or letting them go. Another option, a hybrid option that might be there, is if they're eligible for a discretionary bonus, one of the criteria for that discretionary bonus might be that they've got a clean record. And to the extent that they have been found to be engaged in misconduct, then that might give them a lower performance rating and disentitle them or reduce the amount of bonus that they're otherwise entitled to. So that's how it would work in a non-unionized context. But again, it's a very specific situation. So you definitely want to unpack that with an employment lawyer before you move ahead and implement that particular outcome. But generally speaking, the decision that you have to make is, how bad is this behavior, and is continued employment something that is appropriate in the circumstances, or is this, based on the conclusions, is this the appropriate time to part ways with this individual? And in terms of making that decision, that might be, depending on the investigation outcome, you might dismiss them for just cause, or it might be a without cause termination, in which case you would turn your mind to, what's an appropriate severance package for the individual in the circumstances. I hope that answers your question. Okay, anyone else? Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so I do want to thank you for your time today, and I want to encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. We're on there all the time. We're always publishing helpful content and videos to help you to conduct a better investigation. So please do find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with you. And if you found this presentation helpful, please scan the QR code on your screen, and we'd be grateful if you could leave us a positive review. I want to thank you all for your time, and it was a pleasure sharing this information with you and interacting with you today. And we hope that you will join us for future webinars. We'll be emailing you dates of those upcoming events shortly. Thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoys a pleasant summer, and we'll be in touch with you soon. Take care.